Hello, this is our third lecture for Unit 2 in Anatomy and Physiology 1, and we're going to talk about epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is located in a number of places within your body, including your skin, lining the inside of hollow organs like the bladder and the small intestine and the stomach, lining blood vessels, all the capillaries, medium-sized blood vessels, and the largest blood vessels, aorta and the vena cavas, all are lined with epithelial tissue. Your glands that produce sweat, sebum in your skin, pancreatic glands, any gland in your body that produces a hormone is composed of a type of epithelial tissue. And the cavity membranes that we've already studied, the pleura, the pericardium, the peritoneum, they have epithelial tissue and connective tissue, but we'll look at the epithelial tissue in this lecture. So the functions of epithelial tissue include protection, because they cover not just the inside lining of an organ, but often the outside as well. Epithelial tissue functions in absorption and secretion. It's kind of a delicate tissue and somewhat thin and ideal for diffusion of substances, or I should say movement of any material in any fashion, passive or active, of substances from a hollow space inside your body or from inside your body to a space. So it's ideal for absorption as well as secretion, which is when your body produces something by exocytosis. Epithelial tissue is also important in the kidney, where it performs filtration. So the blood filters through epithelial tissue and wastes are removed, and that becomes part of your urine. This particular picture that you're looking at is epithelial tissue that lines the small intestine. And it's a diagram. They've taken an actual microscopic image and drawn over it so that you can see the individual cells and the nuclei. So the nuclei are these kind of purple circular structures. Notice that they're all lined up. They're not all perfectly the same, but they're all lined up in a row. And one single cell runs kind of elongated in this particular picture. Now, the small intestine has a cell membrane that kind of invaginates and forms these microvilli, which is what you see on the surface there. And also the small intestine has some cells that are modified to produce mucus. These are referred to as goblet cells because they looked like an upside down wine goblet to somebody. But the important thing is these particular functions. Now there are some additional functions of epithelial tissue which we'll talk about, particularly related to the nervous system. Sensation, for example, is important. There are lots of nerve endings often in epithelial tissue, particularly in the skin and other regions, but we'll look at it when we do the nervous system. And the epithelial tissue has a feature or function that is related to mitosis. If damage occurs to epithelial tissue and cells are lost, the rest of the epithelial cells that are healthy can undergo mitosis quite rapidly. So let's look at some structural characteristics of epithelial tissue, in part just to learn about what it does, and in part to teach you how to recognize epithelial tissue in lab. The first thing is that the epithelial tissue that you see in this picture is just this layer right here. So beneath that is where connective tissue lies. Notice that all the cells are tightly packed together, meaning this line is a membrane or two, where two cells are adjacent to one another. There are no blood vessels running in between cells or across cells. There's no blood vessels at all in epithelial tissue, so we say that it is avascular. And because the cells are tightly packed or close together, there's no matrix in between them, meaning there's no material between them, no intercellular material. And finally, this dark layer that you can see at the very base of the tissue is called the basement membrane. And the basement membrane anchors all epithelial tissue to a connective tissue that underlies it. Okay, so there's only one example I can think of in the body where epithelial tissue doesn't have a connective underneath it, and that is in capillaries, because capillary walls are just one cell layer thick. They do exist in your body with loose connective tissue kind of keeping everything all together, but the wall of the capillary doesn't have a basement membrane that connects it to connective tissue. It does have a protective basement membrane, but there's no connective tissue underneath it. We also say that the epithelial cells have polarity. That means they differ on one side versus the other side. The surface that's attached to the basement membrane is called the basal surface. The surface that is open either to the outside of your body or to a space is called the apical surface. And this kind of shows you the same thing I was just talking about. The apical surface will line a lumen, has free space next to it. You won't always see these squiggly microvilli. You might just see a flat cell membrane, but there'll always be a space present, and that's what this area is just space. And then the basal surface, you can usually see under the microscope as a darkly stained region, because to see any of these tissues, any tissue in your body really, we have to stain them with something. Otherwise everything looks gray and white. You can't really see it very well. You certainly don't see the nuclei very well. And the shape of the nucleus gives us an idea of the shape of the cell, even if we cannot see the cell membrane. So if you could not see this line right here or here, this is a really good example, you would know that the nuclei are a little bit elongated, so probably the cells are too. It's just a little hint. So let's talk about the basement membrane just a bit here. The basement membrane, as I mentioned, is located between the epithelial tissue and the connective tissue, shown here by the black arrow. And you know its function is to anchor the epithelial tissue to the connective tissue. But what I haven't mentioned is what it is made of. It is made of collagen, which is a protein, and then variations of proteins. So some of the molecules are called glycoproteins because they're basically proteins with a carbohydrate added. Some of the other molecules are called proteoglycans, just to confuse us, and those are carbohydrates, basically, with a little amino acid sequence stuck on it. So we don't really have to know that too much. What we do need to know is that there's some protein, collagen, and there's some carbohydrate, and that will work just fine. So here are some examples of epithelial tissue. In your lung, this is the space where you would find air in your lung, is lined by epithelial tissue, and it's very thin. This is one cell lining your lung. I can tell that they've gotten in this section a little bit of capillary right here that's running kind of horizontal, because I see red blood cells that are very tiny in there. But the walls of your lung are lined with epithelial tissue, as are the capillaries in all blood vessels. So this is epithelial tissue, and this is where the blood is located right there. You have tubes in your kidneys. They're called renal tubules and nephrons, and they are lined with epithelial tissue. This is the outer portion, and this is the inner portion of the tube. So this is where space is located. Therefore, this part would be the apical surface, and this would be the basal surface. Okay. The small intestine is lined by epithelial tissue. That's what we were looking at in a diagram before. And here is where the lumen is. Okay, that's where the space is. And you can see the goblet cells that are present. And you can see how the nuclei are all arranged in a row. Your skin is made up of epithelial tissue. Now this is not very magnified, this particular picture, so it's very difficult to make out nuclei. I can sort of see dots up here at the top. I wanted to show this picture to you though, to show you how thick skin is in comparison to some of these highly magnified epithelial tissues. There are several layers of cells present here. And at the base of the tissue, there's a darkly stained row of cells, and that's the basement membrane of the tissue. Then in the trachea, things become a little bit crazy. So this is the basement membrane of the tissue. And here is where the lumen is. So the trachea is where you take in air, right, on its way to the lungs. And it's lined with epithelial tissue. But now these nuclei look really strange. You can't make out cell shapes. It's really odd. We're going to talk about how you name this tissue. But it's still quite delicate. And the other feature that you see in tracheal epithelium are these hair-like structures, which are cilia. And the cilia beat fluid, mucus, and particles get trapped in the mucus. Thereby, the cilia kind of move the particles that you inhale. So, the epithelial tissue is found in a lot of places. Now we're going to learn kind of the categories and how you name them so that you don't have to necessarily memorize by organ type. You can look at a tissue and say, oh, I can name that tissue type. So there's two general categories based on the number of layers of cells. So when there's just one layer of cells, we call it simple epithelium. And that's the case lining the lungs, lining capillaries. Whoa, that's kind of crazy. Lining the capillaries and lining the kidney tubules. And I know this because I see one row of nuclei. So there's one nucleus, they're all in a row. Same here, there's a nucleus, there's a nucleus, there's a nucleus, okay? And it's also true in the small intestine. One layer of cells. But in the skin, there's many layers, and so we call that epithelium stratified. Now, when we get down to the trachea and we see this crazy looking type of epithelial tissue, we call it pseudostratified. And that's because it looks like it's layered. It looks like you have one nucleus on top of another nucleus in several places. So you're like, oh, there must be two cells, one on top of the other. It turns out it's not really layered. It's just that the cells are in a funny shape. And so when you section it, it looks like they're layered. So we call it pseudostratified. And we're going to talk about the shapes of these cells in a little bit, but notice that they've outlined a cell here. And it is showing you that every cell really does touch both the apical surface and the basal surface. And therefore, it isn't truly layered. It's pseudo-layered, right? Pseudo-stratified. It fakes you out. Stratified epithelium, the cells up at the top, the apical surface of the tissue, they don't touch the basal surface or the basement membrane of the entire tissue. So that's one way we categorize, is by the number of layers of cells. We also categorize epithelial tissue based on the shape of the cells. So when the cells are flat, as in capillaries and the lung, we call those cells squamous. Sometimes the cells are elongated, like in the small intestine, and we even call the ones in the trachea elongated, and so they get the name columnar. When a cell is cubed, or it looks sort of like a square, sometimes they look like circles or ovals more, but those cells are called cuboid, so we call it cuboidal epithelium. So when we name epithelial tissues, we're going to take into consider those two factors, the number of layers and the cell shape. So you have a bunch of simple epithelium and a bunch of stratified epithelium with variable cell shapes, squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. In stratified, the same, squamous, cuboidal, columnar epithelium. And the way you would properly name them is to include both the number of layers, meaning simple or stratified, the shape of the cell, and then the last word, epithelium, or epithelial. It doesn't matter to me. One's an adjective, one's a noun. And the last little type of tissue that I've alluded to as being different, it's in the trachea. We name based on the number of layers, but it's not really number, it's pseudo-stratified. By cell shape, columnar. That's great. So that's what we have for the trachea. But in addition, if you see cilia, you have to write ciliated. So there's 4 words for the tissue that lines the trachea: pseudostratified, columnar, ciliated epithelium. So I'm going to go back to this for just a second. It seems like there was something I needed to tell you about pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, and I cannot remember what it is. Well, we'll just let that go. So that's how you properly name the tissues. Let's look at what glandular epithelium looks like. It's kind of like kidney tubules in a way, because you often see these round structures with cells that are elongated or cuboidal, and they often look sort of empty. That's because they're secreting so much material. In this case, it's not mucus, it's something else, but it's clear, whatever it is, that's being exocytosed. So it's often cuboidal or simple columnar epithelium. It's always simple. So since glands are made up of glandular epithelium, I want to take a minute and talk about glands. Now, the function of a gland is to produce and secrete a substance. Now, where the substance is secreted, like where it goes into, whatever it makes, will dictate what type of gland we call it. There's 2 types then. There are endocrine glands and there are exocrine glands. Now, sometimes it's a complete organ, right? So if we think of the thymus gland or the thyroid gland, those are complete organs and they're endocrine glands. But some organs have both types of glands. So we really do need to distinguish between these 2 different things, endocrine versus exocrine. So I'm going to do exocrine first. Exocrine glands secrete a substance that goes into a duct to get into a space. And the space that it's trying to get into is either the lumen of an organ or out to your body surface. So for example, your salivary glands. The saliva is secreted into your mouth, right? Sweat glands. The sweat is secreted to the outside of your body. So is the sebum from sebaceous glands that keeps your skin kind of moist, or at least helps it from drying out. Mucus glands secrete mucus into the lumen of a small intestine. And the pancreas makes digestive enzymes that go into the small intestine through a duct. And your tears are secreted through a duct. So those are all examples of exocrine glands. I'm so sorry. Endocrine glands, in contrast, secrete a substance that goes directly into the bloodstream, bypassing a duct. So it's going to get to its target location, wherever that is, by traveling in the blood. And usually what happens is an exocytosis. It could be a diffusion or active transport event, but regardless, the substance goes into the bloodstream. And any substance that travels to a target and causes an effect somewhere is called a hormone. If it travels through the bloodstream, it's called a hormone. So I'm going to say that one more time. Any substance that's secreted by a cell and has a target organ that it reaches in the bloodstream, that substance is called a hormone. There are no ducts associated with endocrine glands. Some examples of endocrine glands include the adrenal gland, the thyroid gland. The adrenal gland makes cortisol and a number of other things, adrenaline obviously. Thyroid gland makes thyroid hormone, and the pancreas even makes hormones. And one of these you are pretty familiar with, I'm sure. People have probably mentioned it around you, a relative or a friend or something, and that's insulin. So insulin is a hormone made by the pancreas, and therefore that brings us to how can the pancreas be both an exocrine gland and an endocrine gland. So we're going to look at that. It's because different parts of the pancreas have different functions and are shaped and structured in different ways. So this is a region of the small intestine right here. And the stomach lies up here. So the stomach is way up here. And the food comes in to the small intestine. Okay? Now there is a duct that leads from the pancreas into the small intestine. And so materials or substances that are secreted by these cells that kind of look like they're in a clover leaf here, those cells, are going to reach the small intestine by this duct. Now, because it's entering the small intestine, you can imagine that these are probably digestive enzymes, and they are. They're digestive enzymes going in there. Now, the pancreas also, as I mentioned, has an endocrine gland portion. And the region of the pancreas that has an endocrine gland is called an islet. And we'll talk about islets in A&P 2. Okay, I'm not going to try to draw that. All right, so here's an endocrine region, or an endocrine gland of the pancreas. And notice that it has a really good blood supply. Not just on the periphery, but the blood vessels are going in between cells and everything. That's because the substance that's made by these cells needs to enter the bloodstream to reach a target. And insulin will affect your skeletal muscle, it'll affect your liver, it'll affect adipose tissue. So it travels all over the place. It affects your brain even. So insulin is a hormone, and hormones travel by the bloodstream. One other place that we find epithelial tissue that I've alluded to are the membranes lining your body cavities. So the membranes that line our body cavities are called serous membranes, and those body cavities are closed. We also have membranes that are open to the exterior of the body, and those types of membranes are called mucous membranes. So the body cavity membranes are called serous membranes. So let's just review that for a second. Epithelial tissue is found in membranes. That's a sheet of epithelial tissue, and we can categorize membranes as either mucous or serous. The ones that are mucous are open to the exterior of the body. The ones that are serous are located in closed body cavities. So mucous membranes would include things like the epithelium lining the trachea, because that's open to your airway, right? The lining of the intestine, because that's open to your mouth, via the stomach, and the large intestine, obviously through the anus. So the function of mucous membranes is to make a viscous fluid that contains some mucus for protection, because you're open to the exterior of the body and there could be harmful substances that come in, or infectious agents. Also important for absorption and secretion of materials, not just mucus. That's different than the epithelial tissue that we find in closed body cavities. In closed body cavities, which we have talked about, the pleural cavities, the pericardial cavity, and the abdominal pelvic cavity, those are all closed, so there's not as much of a danger of harmful agents entering the cavity. Instead, what's important is that movement occur without friction. So you want to make sure that your heart and lungs move easily against other structures that they're next to. So the fluid that's produced by this type of epithelial tissue is called serous fluid, and it's water-based. And this reduces friction. So the peritoneum in the abdominal pelvic cavity, the pericardium in the pericardial cavity surrounding the heart, the pleura in the pleural cavities surrounding the lungs, all make a serous fluid, and that's why they're called serous membranes. Here's a picture of mucous membranes. What's noteworthy is the presence of goblet cells. So we saw in the trachea that there's some goblet cells. This is way too small of a picture for me to show you the goblet cells in the stomach lining, but they're there. This is the lining of the stomach. You'll get to see more pictures of that as time progresses. And then this just shows you that mucous membranes are found in regions that are exposed to the exterior environment. Serous membranes, in contrast, are found in closed body cavities, which I mentioned, and so the pink lines represent the serous membranes that make up the visceral pericardium, the parietal pericardium, the visceral and parietal pleura. Not shown would be the peritoneum, both layers. So I wanted to give you an actual picture of the pericardium, the peritoneum, and the pleura, and tell you that not only is there epithelial tissue there, but there's connective tissue underlying it. So epithelial tissue, as I mentioned, is a little bit delicate, and the connective tissue is a little stronger. So the connective tissue is always found underneath the epithelium. So these arrows that you see are pointing to the epithelial layer that makes the serous fluid. Beneath that layer is the connective tissue, and you can see it's kind of extensive. So this is lung here, an alveoli. Okay. Okay, and one other thing I wanted to show you related to epithelial tissue, just because I love this picture, is the wall of a capillary. So all these cells are red blood cells, and they kind of are in a row, right? Notice that there's a kind of a yellow line here. That's the wall of the capillary. So the capillary is really just barely bigger than the diameter of a red blood cell. And the wall of the capillary is made of the finest epithelium, meaning the thinnest, simple squamous epithelium. And that provides the ideal surface for substances to move across, usually diffusion, like gases, for example. So oxygen is going to be dropped off and carbon dioxide will be picked up from your body tissues. And here's an example of epithelial tissue in the skin. This is the basement membrane of the epithelial tissue down here where it has darkly stained nuclei. And this is the surface of the skin up here. Now we call this stratified because there's so many layers of cells, and the dark circles are the nuclei, so you can tell there's lots of cell layers. But why do we call it squamous? Because down here the cells look almost cuboidal, right? Well, it's because we name epithelial tissue based on the cell shape at the apical surface of the tissue. So this is the apical surface. This is the basal surface. Okay. And the cells up here are flat. So that's why we name it squamous. And here's one that you can kind of see that's flat. I'll get rid of my lines so you can study it. So this technically is stratified squamous epithelium. When we meet for live lecture and we talk about the various topics for next week, this coming up week, week 5, one thing that we'll talk about is what is the ideal epithelial tissue type for diffusion. And another thing to think about is what type of tissue would be ideal, epithelial tissue, would be ideal for lining the surface of an organ that experiences abrasion, like the mouth and the throat. And then liver cells make bile. That's stored in the gallbladder, which I bet you've heard of before. And the way that the bile gets from the liver to the gallbladder is through ducts. So, in this case, the liver is functioning as a certain type of gland. And it's just something to ponder, and we'll talk about it further in our live class session. Thank you.